My name is Jesse Jacobs, and I'm a retired Air Force colonel. And I had over 31 years of military service. I was in World War II and also the National Guard before that. And I've been retired now since 1 July 73 with over 31 years of service. But the last I flew combat in B-17s in World War II. I flew combat in World War II in B-17s and got about 28. I got 28 missions in, and then I got out for a year and a half and got back in the regular Army Air Corps, and then I became what I call a charter member of the U.S. Air Force, because being a pilot still, after I got in the regular Army in '47 in July, 2 months later, the Air Force became a separate service, and I was automatically transferred to it. And then they immediately, after I graduated from what's now Virginia Tech, but it was VPI at the time, Virginia Polytechnic Institute, they transferred me because I was in college when I got my regular commission out of reserve. They transferred me to Japan. And I got to Japan in May of 1949. And they assigned me to a single-engine jet fighter base up at the tip of Honshu in Japan, about 400 miles north of Tokyo, to the 49th Fighter Bomber Group and wing. And then I was assigned as a comptroller or controller, however you want to pronounce it, but it's spelled COMPTROLLER, which was a mal-assignment because I had a 4-engine specialty code assigned to a jet fighter outfit. And so I was flying very diversified, C-46 and AT-6 and so forth. And one day I had the wing commander needed some flying time, and we had wives and children that were living 800 miles away from our base, and we ran what we call a honeymoon special. And we'd go down there about every other week and take the husbands down on Friday and pick them up on Sunday. And the wing commander went with me one Sunday, needing flying time, and I had volunteered for bombers because if I didn't, in my vintage, I was going to wind up in the right seat or something, or because I couldn't get fighters. They didn't need fighter pilots. And I recognized that, so I decided I wanted to be chief cook and bottle washer, whatever I was flying, so I volunteered for B-17s. So I got it, but then I thought this colonel might be sympathetic to my story, so I told him, in essence, what I just told you, that I had it by choice, but at the same time, I didn't always want to be in bombers. I wanted to see if the flying fighters was a bigger mystery as some of the fighter pilots make it out to be. And so he just didn't say anything, and he had been a B-24 group commander in World War II in Italy, and so I thought he might listen, which he did. And then the next day I was transferred to the 9th Fighter Squadron, and I got checked out in the 80. We didn't have any dual T-33s there to learn how to fly it before you flew it. And so I had another guy in an 80 chasing me on my first flight. And after I got comfortable in the airplane, I had done a couple of rolls and decided I wanted to do a loop. So I asked the guy what speed do you do a loop, start to loop? He said about 450. And so I got it up to 450, and I was about 9,500 feet and pulled up. Well, first I asked him, how many G's do you use? He said about 4.5, so I put 4.5 G's on the airplane, and then I must have relaxed the load factor, and I was going straight up. And I said, oh, well, I better suck it in. So I pulled back, and I wound up at the bottom of the so-called loop. It looked like a comma because I was 3,000 feet higher than I started out. But they were kind of flabbergasted that I wanted to do a loop on my first flight. And at any rate, that's how I became a fighter pilot to fight in the Korean conflict. But in the meantime, being a diversified pilot, they were getting rid of all the C-46s in the Far Eastern Air Force. So I flew one back across the Pacific to Ogden, Utah, and I picked up a fresh out of depot C-47, brought it back. I think I got 135 hours flying time in about 30 days. But I had just gotten the C-47 back from the States to Japan when the Korean conflict broke out. And so I went to war at 1:30 in the morning. I went down there to go to war at 1:30 in the morning, right after the Korean conflict started, and around the first part of July. I think it was the 3rd. And so I started flying combat for 10 days. Had 12 missions in the C-47. And then I kept saying I'm assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron, and want to get back to it. So I got back up there where they were in Misawa still, and did a little more training. And then we moved into combat in southern Japan. And we were at Itazuki, flying out of there and doing missions clear up to Wonsan from there, and other places all over Korea. But at any rate, we were the first jet outfit to move into Korea. And it was in September, I believe, of 1950, we moved to K2, and we operated over Taegu, operated over pure steel planking instead of paved runway. By the way, am I telling you too much?
No, not at all. There's just a slight technical problem.
And
reflection on your face.
So I started flying combat out of Taegu. I think, well, I wound up getting 109 missions in the F-80, and I had a total of 12 in the C-47. But one day, the reserve had been called up while I was in Taegu, and they brought C-46s back over there, and the pilot of one crew turned up sick, and so they started looking for people that had C-46 time, which meant I was fairly highly diversified pilot at the time. And I flew the C-46 with his co-pilot and crew for 3 days around Korea with some combat cargo on there. And then I got back into my 80 and wound up finishing. They said when you get over 100 missions, you can quit if you want to. And it was March of '51 by then, so I quit and went back to Japan, where my wife was about to have our 3rd child, which was born in Japan. And we went back to the States on a ship, and we left around the end of May. The child had to be 3 weeks old before we were allowed on the ship. So it was around 1st of June or end of May, I don't remember. But got to the States, and they assigned me an air base near San Rafael, California, just north of San Francisco, at Hamilton Air Force Base. and I became flying safety officer there. But my wife felt like she was overworked with all these little kids under 5 years old, and wanted to get back overseas where we could get help. She had a fair amount of help in Japan from the reparations, but I didn't want to go back to combat, and all the exchange assignments came up were with the Navy or the Marines, and they were going to go back to combat. And so one day an assignment or exchange assignment came with the Royal Air Force in England to go to test pilot school. And I never intended to become a test pilot, never thought I'd get it, but I wound up getting accepted because they wanted somebody with a fairly highly diversified flying experience under 25. And of course, I was almost 29, I guess, at the time. And I went to Empire Test Pilot School in number 12 course, which is a long time ago. It was over was in 1953. And it lasted almost a year from February through December. And came back and was assigned to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, basically flying mostly test beds for the laboratories at Wright Field, and doing some drone ship applications. And I got involved in the downward seat ejection tests out of the B-47 nose for the navigator, bombardier, or the observer that rode in the nose, because they'd had a problem with it with a human subject having a shoulder separation and so forth. Well, they fixed that, and we had to run the test again, and we did it over water down at near Eglin Air Force Base at over Choctawhatchee Bay. And they would have a PT or crash boat down there ready to pick them up when we would fire them out of the airplane, basically at 10,000 feet. So we actually fired people out from about 370 knots through to an end of 425 knots indicated airspeed, and they were very successful. And the last two guys were a first lieutenant and a captain. The first guy that went out was a full colonel, Henderson, A.E. Henderson, and we fired him out. He called me the hatchet man because I fired him with a long cable from the nose back to the co-pilot seat. And I did the countdown for the photography airplanes and so forth on each mission. And the last two missions for that series of tests were done at 45,200 feet. And the reason we know exactly how high it was because we wanted the guys to share the record equally that did it. And so they did, and it was based on theodolite data. He gave up, I guess. But anyhow, they went out at 425, both, or not that fast. It was at 45,200 feet successfully and held the record. And then I stayed at Wright-Patterson doing various tests for a total of 5.5 years. And when I left to go to Command and Staff College, and I was assigned to Holloman Air Force Base for 4 years, and I was flying F-101s and T-33s and so forth, C-130, T-29, C-131B, B-57, and which is a Canberra bomber designed by the British, but is built by Martin over in this country, and highly diversified still. And so stayed there 4 years, and I was head of the all the fighter test programs at that time. When I left, got transferred to the Flight Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base, and signed there for 9 years, but stayed there I was only there 8 years. I spent a year, signed a right to Edwards still, but I spent a year back in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base with the C5 program office, because after I ran the flight test program on a so-called tri-service test force, I had Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines pilots doing the XC-142 VSTOL program, which was a four-engine turboprop with a wing that tilted from 0 at the fuselage on up to past 98 degrees to allow you to hover in a tailwind if you wanted to. But we could lift in that test airplane 8,000-pound payload vertically at 37,500 pound gross weight. And Burt Rutan, who designed the Spaceship 1, Spaceship 2, was assigned to my test force right after he got out of college. Nobody knew he was such an aerodynamic genius at the time, but he was, and I kept in touch with him and still do. But at any rate, he claims that this airplane type or concept would do the mission that the Osprey that the Marines are using now, and they need the airplane, but it's more of a helicopter than it is a fixed-wing airplane because it has tilt rotors, and the rotors can't be lowered to less than about 35 degrees, I think, for landing, whereas the 142 is much more, that concept, tilt wing, is a much more flexible concept. But did that for 3 years, and then got promoted to colonel and stayed for another 6 years. And I ran the C5A flight test program for 6 years, and then retired in '73 on July the 1st. And I had been in experimental flight test work for basically 20 years, counting test pilot school. But the last 7 months I was in the service, I was in charge of the directors of all 8 test forces at the Air Force Flight Test Center. And by the way, they've changed the Flight Test Center name to the Air Test Center because now the testing at Edwards and Eglin Air Force Base and anywhere else in the Air Force reports to the commander of the Air Force Test Center at Edwards. And that's basically the end of my career, although I just touched on Korea somewhat.
Who were some of the other test pilots that you worked with?
Some of the
other test pilots that you worked with during your career?
Well, I've known Chuck Yeager ever since about 1954 or 5, I think, when he was a major. And I was still a captain, but I made major in '58, and I was assigned to Edwards, and Yeager was, well, I knew Scott Crossfield for years, and I knew Neil Armstrong since he was about 27, I guess. I met him in 1957 when he was quite young, before he became an astronaut. And Buzz Aldrin was a next door neighbor after they made the big moon trip, Apollo 11. And I've known Mike Collins for a number of years, and he's another astronaut, but I knew a lot of test pilots. I'm trying to think of some of the ones that are prominent. Well, I knew General Doolittle toward the end of his life, and in fact, we exchanged Christmas cards from the time he was 90 or 91 until he died, when I think he was about 96. The way I got to meet him, his best friend was one of the founders of Ducks Unlimited, and General Doolittle was an avid hunter of ducks. And he used to go down to Burt McKee's lodge or whatever you call it in near Rosamond, California, and they would go duck hunting down there. And but Bert McKee, I got to know before I did General Doolittle, and I was a partner in a partnership on a V-tail Beechcraft Bonanza, and it was an old airplane, but I'd take him up to Monterey or Pebble Beach, which is where General Doolittle lived, was just east of Pebble Beach, and don't remember the name of the assisted living complex, but his wife was virtually in coma for the remaining years of her life. But he always wanted us to go by and speak to her, and she was always in a coma when we went up there. Incidentally, I asked General Doolittle who was the one of the best people that he knew, and he instantly said Winston Churchill, because he had been head of the 8th Air Force when I was in it over in England in 1945, or end of 44 and 45. And I think I already said I got 28 missions over there in England for the end of the hostilities, which was about 2 weeks before VE Day, or rather, May the 6th. I guess that was VE Day of 45. But be glad to answer any questions, or if you want me to elaborate more on anything you've heard, I'll do it. He's gone.
Let me think for a minute. I think you went through all the planes that you were a test pilot on.
Well, at Wright-Patterson, I was current flying some old airplanes that were used as flying test beds, basically, with certain communication tests or things like that. And I was flying the B-17, the Douglas B-26 had been called the A-26 during World War II, but the B-26 was a Martin airplane, but they retired all those right after the war, and so the Douglas became the B-26. And then I flew the B-29, the B-50, KB-50, the B-47, the B-52, and the XB-52. I was flying the XB-52 with a accelerated service test on the J-75 engine, which was the engine they put in the single-engine airplanes called the F-106 and the F-105. And we had a very successful program on the engine that the B-52s had, and a lot of the fighters had, which was the Pratt & Whitney J-57. But the J-75 that they replaced the two outboard engines with 1H J-75 with afterburner on number 1, number 8 position. Number 2 and 7 engines were missing, and 3, 4, 5, and 6 were the J-57 engines, the standard on the B-52. But the XB-52 and the YB-52 were two-of-a-kind airplanes that had tandem seating, and all the other B-52s had side-by-side seating, because General LeMay, who was head of the Strategic Air Command at the time, didn't like the tandem seating, and so Boeing changed them. But we used that XB-52 as a test bed, which I was a project pilot on. And I also flew the B-57, which was a Canberra bomber, light bomber. And
I'm a little curious. Maybe it's off base, but you knew so many of the guys that went into the space program. It sounds like you made a choice not to.
Well, the original Mercury project was the original astronauts, and you couldn't be over 5 feet 11, and that was basically it. Well, I used to be 6 feet 1, but I'm now I could make the thing, except I'm too old, but I'm under 5'11" now. And but those guys had to meet that criteria. So even though I had the same qualifications basically that most of the original 7 astronauts had, I would have turned it down had they asked me. But
Why would you have turned it down?
well, because I wasn't interested. I didn't think it's far enough along, and I wasn't that adventurous, I suppose. But I knew Neil Armstrong, and I knew Cooper, Leroy Gordo Cooper. He flew co-pilot for me a lot in B-47s when he was attending the Air Force Institute of Technology at Wright-Patterson, and I was stationed there, and they needed flying time, so we would let them go with us during the school breaks. And I knew Gus Grissom real well. We were signed to the same outfit, basically, except he was, trying to remember whether he was cargo or fighters, but I knew him quite well. He was fighter because the other guy was cargo that I went with, but I actually went to Long Island, New York, to Lake Ronkonkoma in the Sperry factory with Gus Grissom one time when we had to evaluate a so-called zero acceleration computer that they were trying to develop, so you know the instant you release the brakes whether you're going to successfully make the takeoff or not at a certain gross weight. And never did pan out, but anyhow, we were always back there. Example, in fact, is on that trip, Republic, I think it was. Anyhow, they had an I think it was Grumman. They had an airplane, they had an airplane built to them, which was loaned to them or signed to them by the government to run a project on it. And they needed it moved from Bethpage, New York, Long Island, to Peconic River out on near the east point of Long Island. And I didn't have any flying clothes or mask or helmet or anything, and so I wore something borrowed, and they heard there was a B-57 pilot in the area, and so I agreed to move the airplane for them because the own pilot was out being trained to flight, and I was already current in the airplane, so I took it out there. But that was on that same trip. And in England, I flew the Meteor, the Vampire, the Venom. The Venom was a hot rod Vampire. I went from 20 to 40, I went from brake release to 40,000 feet in 7 minutes without an afterburner, because they didn't have one. And then I flew the Lincoln Bomber, the Hastings Transport, the 2 sailplanes, the Olympia and the Sky. Flew the twin-engine Varsity and Valletta, which was a forerunner of the Varsity. Of course, these names don't mean anything to people here, but I flew the Chipmunk and I can't think of the name of this other one, but in essence, there was 22 different, including the old Hawker Hurricane. I flew it one time. Of course, it's a single-place cockpit, and you're a pilot in command, even though you don't know much anything about it. And the Brits taught me to be a test pilot by basically telling me to go get in a new airplane I'd never flown, go sort it out for yourself. And one of them they had was a fighter. Well, it wasn't I also flew my first turboprop on a modified, they call it Balliol, but I said Balliol. It's B-A-L-L-I-O-L, built by the Bolton Paul Company. And it had a Mamba turboprop in it, which normally had a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in it. And all they gave me on it was the engine limitations, and went ahead and flew it, and the limits on the tailpipe temperature. things like that, but it didn't have the right controls on it. I flew the C-130 a lot. I flew the C-5 a lot. B-47, I already said. The Lincoln bomber looked just like the Lancaster that they used in World War II, except that it looked like it was big enough for the Lancaster to be in the box in it. And but in counting airplanes, I once counted up. I've flown the 747-100, the 200, and the 747 SP. Flew the 767 and the 757, and flew the 727 once for United airline test pilots when they were doing a maintenance test top on it, and flew the 737 for Boeing, and I even got to fly the Lockheed L-1011 with the chief test pilot on it, even though I worked for Boeing at the time. And I was not a test pilot with Boeing. I was hired to be an expediter for their flight test programs. And I don't know, I'd have to have my logbook to go through. I even flew the Mooney Mite one time, and of course the V-tail Bonanza, and I flew the Beechcraft BE-58P, which is a pressurized Baron, and a doctor friend of mine owned it, and I borrowed it a couple of times.
It might be quicker to tell us what you haven't flown.
Well,
But really, thank you very much.